Thank you, everybody who presented today, for a very informative day. Now we're going to invite to the stage some of the presenters session by session from this morning and this afternoon to address some of the questions that have come in from the audience. So for session one, I'm going to invite Lee from FDA, Hassine from Health Canada, and Andy from MHRA. Great, thank you for joining me. So our first question that's come in is actually for Andy from MHRA. When assessing essentiality of a record, does there need to be a formal process for this and the assessment of each record documented?
And the short answer is no. We don't expect the guidance that's contained in ICH GCPR3, I think there's 26 bullets on what makes a document essential. We don't expect any new processes to be put in place that every document or record that comes along, you have to formally assess it against those criteria and document your assessment. That's just going too far. In actual fact, many organizations will have already done this essentially by having a TMF index. They've already decided what documentation is essential, and they may be using the CDIS TMF reference model that sets out a lot of the essential documents that are expected in a clinical trial. I think the guidance is more useful for any adult documents that come across that are unexpected, and you can just use the guidance to decide whether you need it to be retained or not. So I wouldn't expect any additional processes or additional documentation of assessment of essentiality. It's guidance to just help you decide what goes into your trial master file.
Thank you. Thank you. And the next question is for Hassine. Are there plans to merge and harmonize the Part C Division 5 and GCP training requirements? And are there plans to make a more accessible and free platform training for clinical device trials?
Thank you, Regina. So the training session for Division 5, which is the clinical trial regulation in Canada, and the good clinical practices, they are already harmonized and merged. So we offer several sessions in Canada to our stakeholders on the interpretation of the regulatory requirement. And we have a guidance that is available on the website. I will speak about it tomorrow afternoon. So these sessions are offered all the time. And what we do is just we explain the regulatory requirement or the expectation of Health Canada when it comes to clinical trial using human. And we use ICH E6R2 to explain the expectations. And we already provided several sessions, and we are more than happy to provide others. When it comes to making these presentations available, keep in mind that sometimes they are not, there are changes, and whatever we put or we share with the stakeholders may need to be updated. Currently, Health Canada is working on modernizing the clinical trial regulations. We are hoping that we will have a new regulation early into 2026, which probably will coincide with the publication or the adoption of ICH E6R3. And then most, if not all, of our guidance documents will be updated, and then we will have a different training session for our stakeholders. The last time we provided the training on GCP, it was in 2019 when ICH E6R2 was published, and we provide two sessions, one in Ottawa, one in Vancouver. I'm seeing here clinical device trial. So I'm assuming that the question is about medical clinical trial using medical device. They are under different regulations, and it's the medical device regulation, and there's a part, I think part 4 or part 8, I don't remember, that is about medical device clinical trial. We did the pilot, but right now we don't offer any training because it's different requirement. They don't even have to comply with the good clinical practices, or ISO 14, I think 125. We try to incorporate and harmonize all clinical trial regulation into one. So we work towards having one regulation that will cover drug, medical device, natural health product, and even food. But at this moment, we are focusing only on drug clinical trial. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we may have training also for medical device, but not at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. This next question is addressed to Andy, and it's related to GCP harmonization. Is the ICH E6 useful for the statistician?
Absolutely. The current R2 version is useful for a statistician. The GCP is applicable to statistical activities in clinical trials, and during our systems inspection, statistics often is a session that we will spend a lot of time on, looking at how the data is analysed, the quality control and validation of statistical programs and management of data that they're analysing, and production of the analysis TFLs, tables, listings, and figures, for example. And the update to R3 actually includes some specific parts that are applicable to statisticians regarding programming, regarding analysis analysis data sets finalization. There's a whole section on blinding that should be important to statisticians regarding study design and maintaining the blind, and also randomization aspects are covered in GCP. So statisticians are an important part of the sponsor's trial team and contribute to the trial conduct, and therefore they should be trained in GCP and apply GCP principles to the activities that they're undertaking.
Thank you. This next question is for Lee from the FDA. When is ICH E6R3 expected to be implemented? Will there be another round of public consultation after Annex 2 development?
Yes, 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 and yes. If you remember, I had that really long mouthful of the ICH E6R3 EWG Annex 2 subgroup. So they came together and they wrote the concept paper in March of 2023. It takes about 12 to 18 months for that to come together as a draft that is going to be subject for public consumption. So that actually is next month to about September. It takes 12 to 18 months for that. And then once that's compiled together, the whole ICH E6R3 should go live for the public to see thereafter, about a year thereafter. So we're thinking 2025.
This next question is for Hussein. Will the FDA, MHRA, and Health Canada share their inspection reports for sites in India and China to have a coordinated approach to compliance?
Thank you again. So I will speak on behalf of Health Canada, and then probably I will let Andy and Lee to speak about their respective organization. In Canada, we have several information sharing agreements with various regulators, under which we can exchange information. Besides, we have a publicly available database on Health Canada website where we share inspection for now that they have been conducted in Canada. But again, when we go to India for an inspection, or even any other country abroad Canada, and if it's a joint inspection, keep in mind that the inspectors, they speak to each other and they share information. That's what we call them joint or parallel inspections. But there is a legal mechanism through which we share information with our regulators. Clinical trial is global activity, and expect that compliance enforcement will also be a global activity as well. Thank you.
Andy or Lee, do you have anything to add?
Our process of sharing information about inspection findings is set out in the agreements between the regulators. So in some cases with the regulators, we may be able to share an inspection report. In other cases, it's just a summary of what the findings were to inform an organisation. So it depends on the legal agreements between the regulators.
I echo what Andy said, the same with FDA, and I think that looking forward, we set up meetings to collaborate and be able to get even more legal agreements into place so that we can share information and have, this global regulatory back and forth, and at least say, this is what we saw, what are you guys seeing, what's coming in even is what, sometimes we'd like to know, what files are coming in. So I think it's not just the now, it's looking for the future.
Andy, your presentation referred to service providers and not CROs. Does E6 distinguish between the two definitions?
It was a deliberate decision to include the new term of service providers in the new updated guidance, and a CRO is a subset of a service provider. So any organization that takes upon itself duties and functions of the sponsor or duties and functions of the investigator is undertaking a service. And so depending on what that is, they may call themselves a CRO, and they tend to be service providers that provide a lot of the activities and duties and functions of a sponsor. Some organizations don't think they're a CRO because they might provide only a small part, say data management or statistics activities, but they're all doing the same thing. They're undertaking duties and functions of the sponsor or the investigator, and therefore should comply with GCP, and that was a deliberate decision to make that clear in the new guidance.
Great. Thank you for all of you clarifying these answers to these questions and for your respective presentations as well. And thank you for joining us on the stage. Okay, I will now invite Debbie of Health Canada, Elena of FDA, and Mandy of MHRA from session 2 for the session 2 question and answer session. Great. Thank you for joining me. Elena, can you talk about the difference between Alcoa and Alcoa Plus? Which is more formally recognized?
Sure, thanks for that question, Regina. So US regulations for GCP, not GMP, they do not formally recognize any of the Alcoas, including Alcoa Plus, Alcoa Plus Plus, or any other flavor of Alcoa that might be out there. So Alcoa is an important standard that we use to define data integrity. We consider it an ideal. In a perfect world, this is what you should strive for. And while ideal, practically speaking, your data does not have to be perfect. It does have to meet all the components. It doesn't have to meet all the components of the principles of data integrity. Of course, we would be very pleased if data did meet all of those components, but it does not have to. So in the end, the important thing is that the data is fit for purpose and that it's of sufficient quality to support regulatory decision-making.
Thank you. Debbie, for the business case on paper CRF, was that the only source document? If so, what's your position about sponsors? Sorry. That's okay, you're taking control of, can you turn your mic off, Elena? It's her fault. It's her fault. Just
Okay.
kidding. There you go. Okay, good. I'll repeat the question. So for the business case on the paper case report form, CRF, was that the only source document? Was there no other source in the medical records? And if so, what is your position about sponsors creating a paper or electronic tool to collect medical histories?
Thanks for the question. So I know it was a bit convoluted, and I did try to simplify it, but just to clarify, there were source documents and medical records that were created at the investigator sites, but there were also source worksheets which pretty much mirrored the paper CRF. So the entries on paper CRFs were transcriptions, and then the paper CRFs were again used as a reference to transcribe into the electronic CRF. So this caused an increase in the likelihood of transcription errors occurring and also a decrease in the likelihood that these errors would have been detected. Data monitoring wasn't as robust as it should have been because of the lack of risk assessment. And we do recognize that you can have paper source or electronic source at investigator sites, but when you are using paper source, it's not a sponsor-owned system, so sponsors should ensure that the system that's being used for source data do meet the requirements of the electronic records.
Thank you. Mandy, was the marketing authorization application for the rare pediatric product that you discussed approved?
So sadly, it was not. So despite efforts and the sponsor doing the additional analyses, that was helpful for the assessors, but the assessors had other questions, and there were other questions as part of the overall application itself. So sadly, in this circumstance, we did try, but in the end, it wasn't approved.
Elena, there were a number of questions about password managers or other identity verification systems that don't require PINs. Why wouldn't a sponsor just use one of those options?
Okay, thank you, Regina. So first, I'm not going to try to respond from a sponsor's perspective. But I can say that there are risks to every identity verification system, and sponsors should do an analysis of the risks of each system they're considering. And at the same time, they should also consider what kind of data the system is being used for. So if it's critical data, perhaps a primary efficacy endpoint data, like in my example, then the identity verification system would be considered critical to quality, because if something were to go wrong with that system, it would compromise the application. So in this type of case, robust access controls would be reasonable. Another important consideration would be the ease of use of the system given the study population. So you don't want the system to be of excessive burden that might deter the full participation of the participants.
Thank you. Debbie, are paper case report forms required if we enter data directly on validated electronic case report forms with an audit trail?
So this question can be answered in two parts. So the first part is, assuming if you have paper source, there's really no need to have a paper CRF. The example that I presented, this was actually the first example that I've ever come across when there's been both paper and electronic CRFs at a site. So that's why it was very confusing to those that were entering the data, and it became the data wasn't confined to one specific system, and it caused a lot of discrepancies there. So I'm really hoping that everyone received the message that the e-system, any e-system that isn't validated for its intended use results in a negative impact to data integrity. But I think maybe what the intent of the question was, so the second part of my answer will be addressing the scenario when there's a direct entry into a validated eCRF. So the CRF in this case is also considered the source. So in this case, there needs to be additional considerations addressed, and these will include that this should be identified in the protocol, and there must also be provisions in place to ensure the investigator always has access to the study data in the eCRF, so with no downtime. One of the reasons for this is so that data cannot be changed, access isn't available, and this should feed into your risk assessment as well. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Mandy, if data is transposed by validated automation created by the sponsor to avoid repeating data entries, would that be a concern if all is clear and visible to the investigator?
So thanks for the question. So my answer is always it depends. So in the example that I had presented, one option could have been to use a validated method of data transfer. But there are additional considerations with that in terms of looking at your risk assessment. What is that data that is being transferred? Is that method validated? Is the other, so if it's going from another system, is it accurate in that system? So for example, in the example that I had with the interventional study and the end of study visit, had the investigator confirm the accuracy of that data before it then goes into the next study data database. And once it goes into the other study, it can go into a form in the ECRF, but it would be useful if that was then a viewable only CRF, so it can't be modified and changed, because then you will then have further issues with potential data integrity and reliability. So you probably recommend having a view-only form for that as well. So you're really clear on the data flow, on where the data was entered, how you've ensured the accuracy of that, you've ensured that you've got a validated method to transfer it, and then you can't change it further in the new system.
This next question is for Elena. Elena, there were also a number of questions about the use of PINs, security questions and answers. If these were confidential, how did we learn about this during the inspections? How would a sponsor, for example, discover that such an issue was occurring during a trial?
Okay, thank you for that question, Regina. So I'm going to break this down into two parts. So first, given that they're confidential, how do we learn about it during our inspections of the clinical investigators? And so during the inspections for the clinical investigators, the inspectors were focused on the primary efficacy data anomalies. And because this data was collected on an ePro, they looked into the procedures related to ePro access. That makes sense. And what I didn't mention to you during my presentation, mostly so I could get this question for the Q&A, so thanks to whoever sent it in, was that the sponsor inspection was occurring at the same time as at least one of the CI inspections. So we had multiple inspections going at once, and we did communicate with the inspectors quite frequently from the various inspections that were going on to talk about what was going on and what more information would be useful. So the inspector for the sponsor inspection requested the PINs for the sites of interest. And so that's where we got the PINs. We got them from the sponsor, who retrieved them from the service provider who was managing the ePro data. So that's how we learned about the PINs. And later we learned about the security questions and answers. And the sponsor did remark that they don't usually have knowledge of the PINs for various privacy reasons. So that's the first part of that question. And the next part was, how would the sponsor discover such an issue during a trial? So during a trial, the sponsor, that's right, would not have direct knowledge of PINs or security questions or answers, kind of for obvious reasons, but the service provider who manages the ePro data, they should have the ability to monitor this type of information for patterns, right? Whether those patterns are repeated use of the same PIN or PINs that are based on participants' birth dates or other patterns. And it seems reasonable. I mean, I'm not an expert on this sort of thing, but it seems reasonable that they might have programs or algorithms that could monitor for these sorts of patterns. I'm sure there are folks in this room who know a lot more about this than I do in terms of what is possible. But so even without knowing or divulging the details behind what they're finding, I would think the service provider could notify the sponsor if there were concerns like that.
Thank you. Debbie, what exactly do you mean by validated systems, data systems? Do agencies offer a validation, and what criteria must the system meet?
So in simple terms, really what it means is first you have to have a defined system. And then next step is to assess the risk and then effectively control and mitigate your risks. Finally, you need to test your system against predetermined specifications so that you have assurance that it is fit for purpose. And there should be an overall quality system structure in place to drive this process. Larger sponsors have this structure in place, but for smaller sponsors, you really need to have defined standards so that you have the system in place to support the process. And there's several guidances available online, so multiple data integrity guidances, there's a PICS guidance, GAMP guidance, a never-ending list really that's available on all of the agency's websites.
Great. Thank you so much, all of you. We're out of time for this session, question session, but it's been very informative. Thank you. Okay, for session 3, we're going to invite Lee from the FDA. We're going to invite back Haseen and also Jason from MHRA.
Ask you to delete the last question.
Sure, we probably won't make it. So we are going to start with Jason. Jason, what are the biggest challenges or deficiencies noted by agencies in decentralized clinical trials?
So in some respects, they're fairly obvious. That, decentralized trials, they are quite complicated. You've lost the link you had with your investigator, who traditionally would perform a lot of the activities which you're now looking to outsource. So the kind of challenges we see, the bigger challenges we see are very much that, how does the investigator maintain their oversight? What's going on? How do they do it? How does it fit together? Also, how do they make sure they're linked in with the various other parties that are doing the work on their behalf, whether that's the IMP provision, whether that's various vendors of things, all of that kind of lot, how do they fit all that together? Quite a specific one is e-consent, because in reality, industry is not very practiced at it. Guidance has been out there for a while, but it's not widely adopted. And in some respects, the pandemic forced our hand to adopt that and get on with that. So, because none of us are particularly practiced with it, we see all sorts of problems with that electronic consent, those mechanisms for obtaining consent for involvement in these kinds of trials. And you don't really have the same opportunities when you see the patient again and again and again each time they turn up to basically correct it. So that kind of thing exists. You've also got generally the complexities of all the moving parts. Because you miss that hub, there's a lot to stay on top of. When the investigator is in control of all of the things that are happening under their roof, whether that's imaging, whether that's the blood collection, whether that's this, that, and the other, they're much more intimately involved with it. And they sort of do it for lots of studies, or lots of research studies, general practice, whatever it might be. So they understand how it fits together. Whereas in these decentralized trials, they don't really have the same links. They don't know the same people. They don't really have the same contacts. Every trial is different. We know this to be true. So the complexities of things don't necessarily help matters much, and they don't have the ability just to walk down the corridor and go and have a chat or go and get something fixed. I don't know, Haseen, do you have anything to add?
Thank you, Jason. I'm going to provide the Canadian perspective. So, yeah, there is few challenges, at least from a regulatory perspective. As you know, in Canada, and Alicia explained that well, we didn't define what's a clinical trial in the regulation, and we are just using the definition provided by the ICH guideline. However, on the other side, the regulation states that only one investigator per site, and that poses some challenges, at least for our inspectors, on how to deal with these decentralized clinical trials. Also shipping drug to the sites, there is like particularities when it comes to these satellite site or from directly from the sponsor to the homes of the participant. There's an issue also, where should the inspector inspect? Where should the records be kept? And also we have particularities when it comes to provincial territorial jurisdiction. As you know, physicians, they are limited to their province and they cannot recruit outside and provide healthcare. We, in Canada at least, we issued what we call the transition regulation for drug and medical device used in COVID trial. And we put enablers there for decentralized clinical trial. Like we we clarified the remote consenting. We expanded the who can be an investigator to other healthcare professional. Practically is the practitioner nurses. But again, there's challenges, but there are also a lot of opportunities for decentralized clinical trial. So if you have anything to add? Thank you.
Yes, I agree, with my colleagues here that the major challenge here is the complexity of the data flow. And, it comes from different parts and multiple moving parts at the same time, which increase the risk of introducing variability to the data set, as well as increase risk, to the quality and the integrity. And as I mentioned during my presentation, it's important for sponsors, to have a robust and well-defined data management, good data management, and monitoring, training. These are all important things, that you do for standard trials, but it's even more important for decentralized studies. Thank you.
With respect to that, given the at times lack of data quality for decentralized trials, are they reviewed more aggressively than traditional clinical trials due to this decentralized nature? I'd like to ask Lee first.
So decentralized trials are reviewed in the same manner as traditional trials, and they fall into the same regulations, and FDA inspectors will follow the same compliance program as for traditional trials. But that said, we mentioned how complex these studies can be. So investigators and sponsors have to think carefully how you oversee the trials activities that are being conducted off-site. Again, their maintenance, training, clinical investigators, should think carefully about the data they are signing off, that they are accurate, and that they can be followed. And sponsors, whatever electronic systems they are responsible for, they should be able to reconstruct where the data comes from and who has interacted with the data, and basically, good data governance for these types of trial.
Jason, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
I totally agree with you, Lee, in that we don't really treat them any differently, but they're of interest because they're new and they're exciting and they're a different way of working. We also receive lots of news about it. So it's obvious that industry itself is also trying to feel its way through these things. And so as an inspector, that's always of interest then to me. Why pick something which we've seen 100 times over, when you can pick something which is a bit more new, a bit more of a challenge. So we don't treat them any differently, but they're of interest to us just because they're new. I'd just like to echo Lee a little bit there. The key bit really there is to very much explain sort of the operational and translational nature of a lot of these things, how things fit together. And for the sponsor to be on top of that, and also the investigator to be on top of that. And I think that places quite a lot of emphasis on particular roles and functions within these kind of trials. So they're interesting to follow and see how they work, but I think we'll see more and more of them. Did you want to add anything?
Nothing to add, just as in Canada, the same regulatory requirement apply to a decentralized clinical trial or not. And yes, it adds a layer of complexity for inspectors. Thank you.
This third question, Haseen, I'll address to you initially. Are healthcare providers who provide routine medical care to trial participants and thereby contribute data to a DCT considered investigators for the purposes of oversight?
Thank you. So investigator or qualified investigators in Canada, they have to be designed and they have to submit the form, and it's an official function. So just providing routine medical care to trial participant does not mean that you are an investigator. You could be just part of study team or sub-investigator, but in order to be an investigator, you need to really take on and fulfill all of the obligation of the investigator, including be part of the application, be notified by the sponsor, and sign forms. So that's it. Thank you.
Lee, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yes, I agree, the same. If the healthcare provider only provide routine medical care and does not require training for the protocol, then, he's not considered an investigator for the purpose of the study.
Jason?
I don't have any more to add. Nope.
Nothing. Lee, are visits at home to be performed always by physicians? In some cases, nurses perform procedures at patients' homes. Are they allowed to collect adverse events? And how are these then reassessed by the clinical investigator?
This is a good question. No, you don't need a physician to do home visits. It can be performed by nurses. And in decentralized studies, we have seen mobile home nurses, nursing services that will visit the patients at home to collect vital signs, check on the well-being, and they can certainly collect adverse event data. But of course, all this have to be detailed in the protocol, from the beginning. And depends on the frequency of the investigator to reassess this. It will depend on the protocol, but then of course, depends on the severity of the adverse event. The physician might access more frequently if needed.
Thank you. Jason, do you have anything to add?
I think the only thing really to add from my point of view is we rarely see doctors go out to see patients at home. We see plenty of nurses go out to do it, but it doesn't mean it's restricted to just doctors and nurses. There is plenty of opportunity for other healthcare professionals to go and do those kind of visits. So bear in mind the skill set, what they're capable of doing, and depending on what activities are required to be done for the clinical trial, take into account various people's skill sets.
Haseen, do you have anything?
Nothing to add. Well covered by Lee and Jason. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question, but we'll need to be brief. Jason, do you need 2 PIs when a single patient is recruited and treated at a hub center and then followed up in a spoke center when both centers are separate legal entities?
So to keep it short and brief, the answer is no, but it depends, like Mandy said earlier on. It depends a little bit on what the spoke needs to do. So if it's the routine medical care, if it's shared care arrangements, those kind of things, then no, you don't need a second investigator. But once they start getting involved in trial activities, generating trial-specific data, rather than part of that routine care, then that's when you need to start to consider whether or not they should be a site in their own right.
Great, thanks so much to all of you. Okay, for session 4, we're going to call back Shila from Health Canada, Cheryl from FDA, and Andy from MHRA. anywhere. Yep.
Get this.
Thank you for joining me. Andy, what key validation documents should be requested during a GCP audit?
I guess it depends on the purpose of the audit and who's doing it and why. So, and that varies for us as inspectors. So we have done a series of e-system vendors inspections where virtually the entire inspection is about computer systems validation. And what we do there is look at their process for how computer systems are validated, both the software and the trial-specific builds. And we look at their processes, their SOPs, and we typically do a show me approach where they talk through the process and we request to see information that they generate during that process. So that's specifications, testing records, validation reports. And sometimes this actually involves going into electronic systems because a lot of the validation records are actually kept in electronic systems such as JIRA, to name one. There are others available, of course. And so we do look in those systems as well. Alternatively, it may be at a sponsor inspection and that work's contracted out. We may just see some top level documents. So the user acceptance testing, validation report, specifications documents, etc., that the sponsors obtained. But this is one thing we see is that sponsors may not necessarily have all of the documents, or it varies what they have depending on what the vendors provided to them. So this is what I was saying in the essential documents, that the sponsor should make sure they have access to those other records that the vendor has. So the short answer is that it depends.
Cheryl, where does cybersecurity of ePro systems come into play? There seems to often be poorly secured systems being sent home to patients to connect to their home network. Should this cyber risk be disclosed in their consent form?
Yeah, thank you for the question. First, before I comment on whether this should even be disclosed in a consent form, and before putting language like this in a consent form, let me just say that the risk of unauthorized access to the data should be considered in your risk assessment, and you should implement strategies to mitigate the risk from authorized access to the data. So for example, access controls and data encryption. You should also have cybersecurity plans in place to detect, mitigate, and report unauthorized access to data. Security breaches that may affect safety and privacy of your study subjects and the confidentiality of the data should be reported to the IRB and to FDA in a timely manner. So, I mean, I would just caution against putting language like that in a consent form. You really need to tackle the issue before, you know, when you're selecting your device or your ePro or your app for use.
I have a follow-up question for you. What steps should the sponsor take to ensure the investigator's systems are fit for purpose?
So if you're using data from an investigator system and you're using that data in a trial, so let's say you're using data from an EHR, you know, sponsors really need to ensure that it's of sufficient quality and there's an appropriate level of data reliability. You know, in FDA guidance, we encourage use of ONC certified systems because we feel these systems, you know, have built into them the various data security and integrity controls. However, if the system isn't certified, then you'll want to ensure that there are adequate privacy and security controls in place to ensure data confidentiality and integrity. So some of the things that you might want to look at is if the data is attributable. So are authors of records identifiable? Are there audit trails available to track changes to the data? Also, you should review the processes and procedures for use of the system at the site and you know, whether they're adequate and in place. And if the site is using a system that doesn't contain these controls, then you really should consider the risk of, using data from those systems in the trial, and its impact on the regulatory decision. Records also should be, from these systems, should be available and retained for FDA inspection. So there are EHR systems that, are not certified. They may be certified out from other authorizing bodies outside of the US. And so, it would be good, it could be good to collect and maintain that information as, whether the system is fit for purpose.
Andy, a good security system makes passwords invisible to use, so how can a sponsor check what people are using?
Well, I don't think a sponsor should want to check what people's passwords are. Why would they want to do that? I think what the sponsor should be doing is looking at the authentication procedures and protocols that is applied to a system. Like whether it's single factor, two factor, etc. And then they should also be looking at the rules that are around password creation. So the complexity rules, which you're all aware of, because you can never seem to meet them when you first tried it. So it's putting 10 characters in, uppercase, lowercase, special characters, numbers, all those sorts of rules to make sure that you can't use previous ones, etc. To make sure that the password are secure. I think that's the approach to take, rather than trying to obtain everybody's password to check what they are.
Sheila, what defines criticality of a function in a computerized system?
The answer to that is that you need to make a determination on the criticality of the data that that function is responsible for. There should be, again, doing a risk proportionate approach to make an assessment on impact of that, either on safety of participants or reliability of the data.
And what are the requirements, Sheila, for transfers of the data from a system that is going to be retired to a new system?
For the data being transferred or migrated from one system to another, the key thing to have in place is to have a pre-approved plan. You need to have a plan in place to have all the spelled out all the details, roles, responsibilities, the steps, the timelines, and the method of the transfer should be tested, defined, and controlled, and also QCs to be done based on the level of the risk. So again, risk comes into the play, criticality in play, and level of the QC. All of that is also risk proportionate approach.
So those are all the questions I have from your session. Is there anything anybody else would like to add? We have a couple more minutes if you do. Okay, that concludes our question and answer panel. Thank you so much, everybody.